In 2025, nearly 8,000 migrants were reported dead or missing worldwide.
That's according to a new report from the United Nations International Organization for Migration. While the number is slightly lower than the record 9,197 deaths recorded in 2024, the UN says the drop may not reflect real improvement. In fact, around 1,500 suspected deaths could not be verified, partly because humanitarian groups have faced funding cuts and reduced monitoring capacity. And the bigger picture is even more alarming. Since 2014, more than 82,000 migrants are known to have died or disappeared worldwide, leaving an estimated 340,000 family members directly affected. Many of those deaths happen in what researchers call invisible shipwrecks. These are cases where entire boat disappears at sea with no survivors, no wreckage, and often no record of what happened. Despite tighter border controls and fewer arrivals in some regions, the report says the risks have not disappeared. Instead, migration routes are shifting, and in many cases becoming more dangerous. More than 4 out of every 10 deaths last year occurred on sea routes to Europe, making the Mediterranean one of the deadliest migration corridors in the world. But Europe is not the only danger zone. Across West Africa, the route north toward the Canary Islands recorded around 1,200 deaths, and in Asia, deaths reached record levels, including hundreds of Rohingya refugees fleeing persecution in Myanmar or escaping desperate conditions in camps in Bangladesh. These journeys are often undertaken in overcrowded boats, unsafe vehicles, or remote desert crossings, routes where rescue is rare and information is scarce.
So the reason why there are so many people who die trying to reach their countries of destination is because these paths are exceptionally dangerous, right? If we take the average Pakistani who leaves Pakistan, tries to enter Europe, often they take what is known as the eastern route, which is from Balochistan, the Taftan area, into Iran. There's a lot of desert area in Iran. Some of that has to be transversed on foot at times. So under the scorching sun, exceptionally high temperatures, sometimes 46, 47 degrees in some places in Iran. Those are transversed. They go up to the north of Iran, and from there they enter eastern Turkey. Now this region, often crossing borders especially, becomes problematic, and that is often done on foot at times. Eastern Turkey, especially during winter, is exceptionally cold, right? So these are below freezing temperatures in a mountainous region, can lead to death very easily, right? Hypothermia and things like that. These individuals then cross Turkey. There can be problems there as well. They're often not treated very well because by the smugglers or by the traffickers. They eventually reach the border with Greece, and this border. It's the border between Greece. The land border is between the Evros River, is really what divides the two. And so crossing that, when you have border guards on the Greek side who are willing to shoot, and we've heard of stories and we've heard documented cases where Greeks border guards have shot at persons trying to enter, use live ammunition, tear gas, and all of these things against people who've been trying to enter their territory. They've thrown them back into the Evros River. Some of them have been even drowned. And this is just the land route. The other is, places in Turkey, Çanakkale, Balıkesir, where they can take boats and try to enter some of the islands in Greece and try to seek asylum there. Or if they make it a mainland Greece, then they can travel northwards into Europe and elsewhere. Many times what we've noticed is the natural calamities that can take place, and people can lose their lives, but there's also a lot of man-made stuff. We know that Pakistanis who reach, for example, northern Africa and then try to cross the Mediterranean into Europe, they've been pushed back. We know that the Hellenic Coast Guard just this year in February of 2026 deliberately rammed a boat which ended up killing 15 people. The Greeks are particularly, guilty of these things, and this has been noted not just by me, but by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, European Union's own Frontex service. So it's genuinely an issue. It's a very dangerous path that they take, and part of this is deterrence. They want to deter people from coming, and so they make it even more difficult for them to do so. Secondly, when we talk about border hardening, having more border guards or having more posts there to ensure that nobody crosses the border illegally, or setting up fences, what that does is it leads to people taking even more dangerous paths to enter, right? Where there's fewer border guards. It's a more mountainous, or it's a more porous or difficult area to enter. And that leads to further, deaths like that. When we talk about the numbers clearly, I think across the board, it is accepted that these numbers of people who die on the way there are significant undercount. They do not represent really the actual numbers, because people who die without any, bodies found in deserts, or bodies found frozen in mountainous regions or in the wilderness, those are not really documented, even though most likely these were migrants who were trying to cross and they died on the way. So unless it's reported, or unless people are apprehended and then they're interviewed and they say that, we came in these types of numbers, we lost this many friends or companions on our way, there's really no way to ascertain this, right? So the IOM, the International Organization for Migration, they have a Missing Migrants project, which tries to document some of this. But again, much of this is based on reporting, and unless somebody has reported this, it's not going to happen. So many people who die, while crossing large water bodies, the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, etc., those could be, undercounted or not counted at all.
Behind every statistic in the report is a personal story. People fleeing war, economic collapse, political repression, or climate disasters often feel they have no safe alternatives. For Rohingya refugees, the choice is between persecution in Myanmar or life in overcrowded camps in Bangladesh. For migrants leaving West Africa, it can be the combination of economic hardship, political instability, and environmental stress. And once these journeys begin, migrants often rely on smuggling networks, paying large sums of money to travel through dangerous and poorly monitored routes.
So as I had mentioned, conflict, economic hardship, climate change, these are all drivers of migration, right? And much of this is lawful, legal migration that takes place. But much of this is also irregular migration, especially for those who are most affected, the most vulnerable. They may not have the opportunities or the skills or what is needed by many of the developed world to lawfully apply there, and therefore they're suffering in that way. Now, conflict is still dominant in much of in areas in the Middle East, whether it was Syria and Iraq initially, but it's also now you can see it happening in Sudan and elsewhere in Africa as well. So that will remain a driver of migration, especially when it's as large scale as we see in some places. Economic deprivation, I think, is one of the biggest reasons people go to find better standard of living, to be able to support their families back home, and that will continue to be an issue. Now, more and more, we're seeing climate change. And climate-induced migration is perhaps one of the biggest forms of such migration that is going to take place. In fact, the World Bank projected that by 2050, 200 million people will be climate displaced. And that means that, whether it's drought or it's other forms of mechanism that are going to cause, people to leave their homes and leave their places. So that's something that I think we need to keep in mind, that unless we can deal with these issues, whether it is reduce conflict in conflict-prone areas, try to reduce the mechanism, whether it is through UN intervention or peacekeepers or something along those lines, right? There needs to be a significant increase in that effort. The climate change, there are mechanisms across the world that have been implemented and that need to be implemented. I think loss and damages is a major one, but also understanding that there is an obligation on developed states who have polluted their fair share, and now the rest of the world is suffering for that. And finally, I think economic deprivation, the world really needs to focus on a lot of these things, whether it is through mechanisms like debt forgiveness or other economic programs.
The UN says better data and monitoring are essential to reducing deaths on migration routes. Without accurate information, authorities struggle to identify the most dangerous routes or plan effective rescue operations. But the report also points to larger structural issues.
So policies to reduce deaths, there are several. One of the biggest is having better search and rescue. So the people who are, say, stranded, who are trapped, who are drowning, whose boats are capsizing, that there are, mechanisms to rescue them. There's also, looking at it as a whole, if you increase lawful mechanisms for entry, then people who, want to get jobs, usually it's in labor or it's unskilled labor or things along those lines, they can apply for those jobs. A lot of those don't lead to Europe. A lot of those jobs are available in the Middle East for Pakistanis in the GCC and the Gulf. But there's few, that are available in Europe. And that's something that, that's why you see still a lot of irregular migration going there. You can also try to improve conditions domestically, right? And that's where a lot of effort in, say, resettlement, reintegration, or improving the economic indicators and the human rights conditions in countries takes place. There's also issues like conflict and the environment, climate change, really, that can have an impact on why people are driven out of their country, of their countries of origin, their home countries, and choose to go abroad. What I would say is that it has to be a mix of these ideas, and much of this also has to look at political will. Is there enough political will on either side? Whether the countries that are from where people are originating from, whether they have the political will to take steps to stop this, because often these people, when they go abroad, they send remittances back, right? That's a lot of money. In Pakistan's case, it's $38 billion annually. So do they want to limit the people who go abroad there? The second is, the countries that are receiving these, do they want to do this? Because right now, the European Union, which has been at the receiving end of many of the people who want to go there, they've been outsourcing or funding programs, border control issues in say, Turkey or Libya, Northern Africa, to prevent people from coming there. And so they don't have to take the difficult decisions. Another issue is, once they come to your borders, you are under a duty to at least entertain some form of an asylum application, to assess whether, they are, the people are escaping some form of genuine persecution, based on certain factors. And that's really refugee law that applies there. And you're under an obligation not to refoul, which is not to send people back to where, their life or limb could be at risk. Or human rights abuses could take place against them.
Experts argue that safe and legal migration pathways, stronger search and rescue operations, and international cooperation are needed to reduce risk. Until then, migrants may continue to rely on irregular routes, often with deadly consequences.